Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to talk about the 1972 science fiction film ZPG, which stands for Zero Population Growth. And you can see the tagline on the front of the DVD here. Smog covers the earth, the oxygen is depleted, love is encouraged, but the penalty for birth is death. And the time is tomorrow, and there's no time left. So a little bit kind of tells us the story there. Yeah, so this is a dystopian movie, a very almost a standard. Dystopian movies in the early '70s were almost becoming standardized, and this movie has so many of the tropes that we see with '70s dystopia, although with a completely different approach in terms of the scenario or the premise of the movie. So we're in the far future, and the movie begins. We're in cities that are covered in smog. So that's one part of this future. Smog is everywhere. People are on screens, communicating through screens, and there's a lot of that in the movie. And there's a lot of surveillance as well. People are the powers that be watching what people are up to. But the premise of the movie is that people are not allowed to have children anymore in this future. So this is due to overpopulation. The idea being the earth is so polluted, so overpopulated that the only thing the government can do is ban people from having children. And if people do have children, they will be executed. Okay, so or liquidated is the term they use in the movie. So it's yeah, and there is some historical context for this concern with overpopulation. A few other movies got into this, and I mentioned ecological sci-fi last time with Silent Running. But there was a book that came out. I've never read the book, but The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, I believe, which is cited a lot, which was a groundbreaking book about overpopulation. And the long and short of it was the book made some very grim predictions about the future, not the distant future. Like Ehrlich was talking about mass famines all over the world through the '70s into the '80s, and very high death counts. And yeah, so very very grim predictions about overpopulation. And this was not a new thing. This goes back to Thomas Malthus, I believe, in the 18th, 19th century, writing about if a population gets too big, it puts the food supply in jeopardy, and resources are limited, and all those types of things. And the population of the Earth was exploding throughout the 20th century, at remarkable rates. And some countries were starting to take action over concerns about overpopulation, and probably as a public policy issue, it did hit it. It was starting to like have cultural impact by the early 1970s, and this film was one example of that, where discussions about whether to have children or not, and or limiting the amount of children people have, or just what what can we do now to prevent some kind of cataclysm in the future due to overpopulation. And so anyway, the movie's scenario, like I said, people are not allowed to have children. And the film does star Oliver Reed, the iconic British actor, and Gerald D. Chaplin as well as the main characters in this movie. They play a couple who want to have a child and decide to have a child in secret, and of course complications arise from there. They realize the stakes of what having a child will be, and well, they do have the child. They, not. have the child, and at one point before they have the child, they can't get a doctor or anything to help them out, and Oliver Reed is at like a computer terminal doing what like would be a Google search today about how to oversee the delivery of a baby, and immediately he does that search, and there's like, he is swarmed by security forces, and he's immediately thrown into this like torture room, and questioning him about why are you looking for that, so there is, talking about today, we worry about surveillance today, people, thinking about your Google searches, but in this movie it's instant. They don't waste time with them trying to root out dissidents, I guess you might say. But yeah, and so they do have the child, and some of the other things in this feature I've mentioned, and there's also a scene with food when they're at a restaurant, and basically people just eat like pellets of food, I guess, and that might mimic the taste of your favorite food. So that's another thing too, where the type of food people eat is very different and things like that. So, like I said, they have the child, and then the second half of the movie, and I think what this movie really suffers from is just a lack of drama in this movie. There's, the performances by Reed and Chaplin are not too emotional. They're very stoic throughout the entire movie, so it's hard to connect with the characters or even why they want to have a child so much. So there is something there with the lack of drama in this movie. Like there's this other couple who are a friend of theirs who also know about they have the child, and this other couple gets jealous, and there's sort of like this I don't know, like this conflict begins over the baby, and the other couple want the baby for themselves. So it's and that's basically it. And really, in the final act, final section of the movie, they have to escape Oliver Reed and Geraldine Chaplin, and it's kind of mimicking like the nativity story, from the New Testament, where they have to they've had their child and they have to flee the authorities to a different place so they can, you know, live as a family and harmony and things like that. So it's and the end, Children of Men, another movie that will deal with issues of birth and birth rates and things like that, has a similar ending. So it is interesting how these two movies do have a similar ending. Yeah. So this was directed by Michael Campus, and this was put out by Paramount Pictures. Yeah, I did not mention that. So, not a lot of drama. Some interesting ideas though in the movie, and there's also a thing too in the movie where you have like little child robots that the government gives out to people who, as a substitute for not having a child, and they almost resemble Megan, of course, Megan from the recent movies of an AI toy gone crazy. But in this movie, they're a little more Teddy Ruxpin than Megan. The the robot kids don't really do much, so that's kind of sad, really, and thing that's added into this movie as well. Yeah, yeah. So like I said, it does raise issues about like it's mentioned around this time the movie came out where abortion was being legalized throughout in the United States anyway, and this movie interestingly like kind of reverses that idea where it's like abortion is like encouraged in this movie, like if a couple does have a child, whatever, accidentally or something, like they have to get the abortion immediately. So the film kind of flips that idea, but it is still men making these decisions about women's bodies. The film starts out, there's like this old man laying down the law about what to do with kids. So there is, the movie never really explores the idea of gender and the gender dynamics of having children or anything. It's it's just really about this couple who just really want to have a child. There's really no politics behind it. And also in the movie as well, there's in the narration, like they're constantly getting like this propaganda about how awful people were in the 20th century. I believe the quote to you is the degeneracy of 20th century man, and there's films of people eating these large meals of meat and filling up gas tanks. They go to a museum of like the 1970s, and it's all about how wasteful and selfish people were in in the 20th century. So well, you know, we who knows with legit very legitimate concerns today about warming climates and what that'll do and melting polar ice caps and all that. I mean, there is, you know, and a lot of it is caused by human activity. So it is interesting in this future where people are constantly being reminded about how awful people were in the past, which something to think about. You know, it's a great question to ask. Like, what are we doing today that people in the future might find absolutely awful, repugnant, even? So I like how the movie raises that great question as well. You know, and the issues of natalism are always interesting. Like in the early 70s, like I said, there was concern about overpopulation and there was, you know, there was an actual movement called ZPG where it was about trying to find public policies that would, you know, keep the population down. Countries like China and India, you know, actually passed laws about that attempted to regulate the birth of children and things like that. But today, like we hear all about, there's about the declining birth rate in the Western world specifically. You know, you hear about how you know there's people aren't having children in the numbers that they had in previous decades. You know, there's a certain part of the political spectrum really likes to get onto that issue, and the discourse around that is always interesting. I mean, on a very basic level, I suppose you need to have like a newer generation coming up to hopefully be around to keep you know everything going, civilization. But today, you know, I'm reading some articles about this, how there's financial concerns today. You know, it's very expensive to have children, and the government doesn't help a lot. You know, like family leave, paid family leave, all these issues where, on the one hand, there's concern about declining birth rates, but it seems as if the government just, you know, there's been like some governments have like thrown out like tax incentives or gifts, like straight out cash for having children or something. But yeah, I think the economic realities of it are real these days, just the expense of it. And honestly as well, and a lot of things with the pronatalists, those who want higher birth rate, you know, that gets into discussions of gender too, and this need to obsession almost with gender roles and this need to go back to some idyllic time of traditional gender roles. And that's kind of part of the discourse these days too. But typically, in fact, you can never really go back to some idealized version of the past. You just can't. I mean, there's far better solutions to these issues. But also, I think the state of the world, you know, the state of the world in the early 1970s was grim, but today it's many would say it looks even worse these days. About is it worth it to even bring children into this world where there's you know, if the environmental concerns, concerns about politics and authoritarian governments and wars and all these things. I mean, it seems like we haven't learned anything from the 20th century in some ways, and so it's that's just my perspective. I mean, but things just feel really fraught, you know, in the 2020s of how vulnerable we are to so many different things that could come up, and the future does look frightening a lot of the time. So and hopefully that the optimistic thing to say is that comes in waves, where there are times where the future does look brighter. There are times, difficult times where it doesn't. So it's always hard to gauge these things. So anyway, yeah, ZPG, probably a more interesting movie to actually talk about than to watch, because it's, like I said, it's kind of a curio from the decade, and doesn't, as a dystopian movie, it, besides the plot premise, we get a lot of stuff we've seen in other movies and things like that. But like I said, it does raise a lot of great questions, and some interesting discussions can be had, I think, after watching this film. So anyway, okay. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later.